Oh yeah, lesions. That's a deliberate mistake.
I was hoping.
These are real lesions, as you'll see. In fact, I'm going to describe to you some of my experience in the last 10 and 20 years. I concentrate on the history of Australian radio astronomy. As you know, I'll be talking about some detail of that tomorrow and the connections that Joe Pawsey has with Canadian radio astronomy, and can explain then the accidental reason that did happen. But these lesions, of course, I'm going to describe to you some mishaps that I've had and some discoveries I've made, and I'm going to describe to you what I now call the not dark energy or dark matter, but dark archives. In the Australian field, I'm following in Woody's footsteps, so I'm often using him as a guide, and it's often very reassuring to me when I, yet again, as it was a few months ago, I'm looking at a place in the National Archives of Australia, and on archive after archive, I find in Sally Atkinson's handwriting, save for WTS, for Woody Sullivan, probably written in the 1970s and 80s.
She was a secretary.
Yeah, I'm going to explain. Yeah. She's going to be the main player.
Oh, okay.
As I'm going to get to her. Also at Churchill College, your work on the Martin Ryle archive, which you did such a kind of a pre-selection as the incredible finding aids were made for the Ryle archives, and I have found those incredibly useful. Finding about, in fact, there's a lot of Australian information in the Churchill College archives with Pawsey. Taffy Bowen, in fact, has a lot of his material at Churchill College. You know, I've spent many, many hours there. And again, I can see Woody's handwriting, and this is not illegal handwriting in the archive. It's legal. And let me tell you one story about Churchill College, which I've been there probably 3 or 4 times. I've discovered that you have to behave extremely well there. Of course, naturally, using your camera, you have to be careful. That's a new thing in archives, using your camera. You can't use a flash. And the last time I was at the Churchill College archives, I was looking at a document, and I had it like this, and all of a sudden it came to the edge of the paper and started drooping. And the people started guiding up, started yelling at me, said, "You can't do that." You couldn't have the piece of paper drooping off the edge for obvious reasons. So the etiquette in archives can be important. Now, fortunately, in Australia, Ron Eakers and I have an additional collaborator on our Pawsey book that I'm going to tell you about. She is a Canadian-Australian. She has one Canadian parent, one Australian parent. Her name is Claire Hooker. You don't know her. She's a historian of science, but a very well known historian of science. And it helps to have a historian of science as a collaborator because we can check a lot of things with her. And in fact, I have been so darn lucky, these have prevented a few lesions in Australia, is that Claire has gone to a couple of the archives with me for the first time, like the Mitchell Library, the State Library of New South Wales. There is not much there, but there are a lot of very important material there, and Claire has gone there and introduced me to the process, because I've learned if you go to each archive, it has its own protocol and its own tricks. And there's one obvious trick that I have learned at an archive that I've learned from a lot of other people, including my son, who's a historian, is if it's not too big, when you go to the archive, identify your friend. You need one friend that you can count on. Somebody that when you forgot something, you can send them an email and say, "Oh, so-and-so, I forgot to copy the following page," and they're not supposed to do it, but they will, in fact, very often. And I think I've perfected this very well, at least in the National Archives of Australia. I always have my friend, and the problem is now they're all retiring, and I'm getting kind of desperate because my last friend at the National Archives of Australia in Sydney retired a few months ago, and I'm feeling kind of desperate about that. But let's go along. So let me just make one other comment about, I don't want to repeat everything that Woody says, which I agree 100% with. My experience with oral interviews, I have interviewed a number of people in common with Woody, but often 10, 15, 20 years later. Now this has a big liability, of course, because things have been forgotten. But I can say there are exceptions and there are pitfalls. An example is, I think we can say, because Woody, in fact, pointed this out, one of the most unreliable respondents in Australia was John Bolton. In fact, during his life, even, it's very striking that Paul Wall wrote a letter to Woody once, which we've all looked at many times, saying to Woody, Paul says, you must take a lot of what John says with a grain of salt. And this is absolutely correct. So that is a great disappointment because John Bolton is such an important figure in the history of Australian radio astronomy. He was an important figure in my life when I spent many years as his postdoc, and he certainly influenced me. And the irony is, and those of you who have read my books will realize that the reason I got my family would say, fixation on Ruby Payne Scott, sometimes almost a psychological fixation, is because John Bolton told me one day, sitting in his office in the wool shed at the Parkes Telescope, where Jasper and I would sometimes meet John, and I would go and sit, he would talk to me for hours, and he said to me, you should have been here. This was a statement made in the 1960s. You should have been here 15 years ago. You could have met the brightest physicist that ever worked at radiophysics, Ruby Payne Scott. Well, I never forgot that. Now, it was only many years later when I told Letty Bolton this story that the reason I had written 2 books about Ruby was because what John said. She started laughing. She said to me, you don't understand the monumental irony of what you just told me, because John and Ruby were bitter enemies. There's an important message in this experience. Ruby would not be known in Australia now without John Bolton, because John Bolton told me this. I remembered it. Unfortunately, it took me many years to get working on it, and I started working on Ruby, found out a lot about her, got to know her family, etc. And I'm so proud now when I go to Australia every year. It happened this year, a couple of months ago. Every time I go to Australia, somebody tells me about another Ruby Payne Scott Award. Sydney University has one now. There are so many now Ruby Payne Scott Awards that I've lost track of them. Whereas a few years ago, every time someone wanted to start a Ruby Payne Scott Award, say for awarding financial aid to a returned mother scientist at CSIRO, they would talk to me to get some assistance writing up the history. Now they don't even talk to me anymore, which is great. But let's move right along. So let's talk about quickly dark archives. Now let me go just a little bit forward. And if you go to the Australian archives, you can get pretty good finding aids, although they're quite inferior in general. There is about 50 meters of radio astronomy archives. As you know, in an archive, it's a linear measure. 50 meters is a huge archive. This is radiophysics archives from 1939 to 1983. There's a finding aid for C3180, which is all the most, about 90%. And you read this. The bottom sentence is the only thing that counts. Files in the custody of the archivist, which is Sally Atkinson, were sometimes consolidated and top numbered. Some files are believed to have been culled. That is, they've been selectively preserved. And this is exactly what has happened, because Sorry, I've got some of these things out of order. Here is a file that I found that had been thrown out by Sally Atkinson. It had been thrown on the side of the street, and a friend of mine picked it up because he thought it was important. And about 20 years later, he gave me this file. It was put out for rubbish. Alphabetical sequence copies of Outward's correspondent, United Kingdom, Mr. J.A. Radcliffe. Very important respondent. Martin Rawls, mentor, founder of ionospheric research, really, in some sense, after Appleton left the Cavendish Laboratory. Joe Pawsey's thesis advisor, Ron Bracewell's thesis advisor, the patron of radio astronomy in the early days at the Cavendish Laboratory. And look what it says at the bottom in Sally Atkinson. Note, no letters had been culled from this file. Essay, Sally Atkinson. So, we were all pretty nervous about reading these hundreds of files that Sally Atkinson has archived. As she retired in about 1975 as Bowen's secretary, she worked as a volunteer archivist for many years. She did a fantastic job. And one anecdote is the last personal meeting I had with her was about 1999. I was in Sydney working with Jim Caswell. Many of you know him, his connection to this place. I was going to walk home with Jim, have dinner with Jim and Sheena. We walked by Sally's house. We knew that was where she was. I'd been there before. And we walked in, and she was incredibly cordial, helping us, showing us some pictures, giving us afternoon tea. But she was getting pretty old, and now I'm going to move back quickly to some more details about her. The Lost Archive. Because the year after I was in her house with Jim Caswell, I called her up and said, Sally, there are a couple of questions I have. May I come? And she was extremely upset. She began to weep. She said that she was getting senile and she didn't want to talk to me anymore. And I said, fine. I could understand that. I respected that. So, she died in 2012. And she had lost contact with the people at the Institute, which is ironic and tragic because it was only, as you know, it was only a kilometer or so away. Fortunately, her neighbor who had ended up looking after her and is an incredible human being, Ron Eakers, and I've gotten to know Don Stevens very well, found a lot of material in her house, a great deal of material. He realized it was important, called the people at the park's telescope. That's all he needed to do. They immediately got in touch with Ron Eakers. Ron and his wife, Jay Eakers, got in a car, went over there, and picked up this material. It was about 5 meters. A year later, Ron realized there was only one person, Woody could have done this, or Woody or me, could go through this material and sort it out. And it's like the usual thing with an archive, the signal noise is incredibly low. This is the needle in the haystack in a haystack. So, in fact, there are two incredibly important finds in this material. I found it within the first hour in Ron's office. This is Sally Atkinson. Some of you knew her, an incredibly important figure. She started work there as a young woman in 1942, so she saw World War II, and she stayed as the personal assistant of Atkinson, of Taffy Bowen. And you see Dave Johnson in the background. That's Sally. This is the archive in Ron's office. So in a few minutes when I started finding these things, of course you can imagine the exclamation jumping up and down. Ron thought I was a bit crazy. But what did I find? Number one, I found the first records of Australian radio astronomy. Not copies of, but the first records. It's a long story I've written up in the book. These were the records that were not from Dover Heights, but from the Coleroy, RAAF, the Royal Australian Air Force Station, north of Sydney. Some of you may know where Coleroy is. This is where the most important early solar work was done by Joe Pawsey and Ruby Payne Scott. They were so lucky they started observing there on the 3rd of October 1945, and one of the largest sunspots of the 20th century appeared a couple of days later. Now that's number one. Number two, the coincidence is they were great friends with Clay Allen. Most of you know him. C.W. Allen, Astrophysical Quantities. That's him. He was a solar physicist at the Commonwealth Solar Observatory, as it was called then, not the Commonwealth, not the ANU Observatory, the Mount Stromlo Observatory. So they observed for 3 weeks. The sun went into great activity. They were observing at 200 megahertz. They turned the transmitter off. It was one of the lightweight aircraft warning radars. I'll show some pictures tomorrow. You could only move them in azimuth, not in elevation, so you could only look at sunrise. They didn't see any fringes from small sources yet. That was discovered a couple of months later by Ruby Payne Scott, but they started seeing this incredible increase in the solar activity as type 1 bursts began to be associated with this huge sunspot that was visible in October 1945. So immediately, in 3 weeks, the last day of observations, Joe Pawsey sent a telegram to Nature. The whole paper was in a telegram, which he showed the complete correlation, almost perfect correlation between sunspot number and the radio intensity, which was a type 1 burst. So this, you can see, was a very important discovery. And think about the incredible luck that they had been observing for 2 days. The first time they ever observed, and 3 weeks later, their first paper is sent to Nature. The other thing that was in the data that they found later, but was, of course, it was the quiescent level of 200 megahertz, where they found that the radio intensity never dropped below 10 solar flux units. Ken and I have been discussing who invented solar flux units. We're not getting anywhere, but a solar flux unit is 10 to the 4 Janskys. So they were seeing, of course, the quiet sun, the solar corona, the million-degree corona that Woody mentioned, that so I'm actually running out of time. I want to quickly go through this. The other piece of the smoking gun are 2 papers that became very controversial. This was in the dark archive we found in Sally Atkins. There were 2 of the files from 2 papers. The 2 most controversial papers of the first year of the Parkes Radio Telescope, the discovery by Ron Bracewell of the large polarization in Centaurus A, and the subsequent observations a few weeks later by Mark Price and Brian Cooper of the Faraday rotation from the nuclear source in Centaurus A. Both of those files were missing. We had been looking for them for years. Sally Atkinson had taken them out of the system.
What was the motivation?
I'm coming to that. The motivation was she was preserving, to some extent, Taffy Bowen's reputation. Taffy Bowen interfered with the publication order of the papers in Nature, which we have the letter. These 2 files, I had looked for them. I found the complete collection at the National Archives. They were missing. We have them now. Ron has them, and he's going to put them back in the system. So this includes something. These are the papers to Nature. I won't read them, in which Bowen is saying, well, our guys made this discovery, but it was made after this other man, Bracewell, from another institution, who actually is on sabbatical leave at the Sydney University and doesn't work for us, et cetera, the implication. And please make sure that our paper is published first. So the papers, Bracewell's paper was sent about 3 weeks before, and it was published 2 weeks afterwards. Ron Bracewell was very upset about this. He talked to me continuously through the years. He's talked to Woody, a lot of other people. He's written a paper about this, and unfortunately, I only discovered this 2 years ago, and Ron had died in 2007. I would love to have shown this to Ron. And there's something else here. Sorry. Oops. Got to go back.
No problem. Okay, we'll go to the last.
I went too far.
No problem.
I don't have a copy here. We found then something else that I think is very interesting in archives, and there is a literature on this. This is the unsent letter. Those of us who've done archival research will know unsent letters occur very seldom, but when you find one, pay attention to it because there's something very important. Sally Atkinson wrote Ron Bracewell a letter explaining the whole story about the Centaurus A scam. I'm saying you would have to say. She never sent it. At the top of the letter, which I have a copy of, it says not sent. Last thing on the Dark Archive is I have discovered that the National Archives of Australia has so saturated with files that they had about 100 or 200 radiophysics files which were in the archive, but which had not yet been classified. They had been there for 20 years. I found out about these by talking to the previous CSIRO archivist in Canberra, who told me about the existence of these files. He had actually sent them there, and unfortunately, it's a tragedy. CSIRO in Australia have canceled their own historical research themselves, so they've given up. So my friend, the previous archivist, Ron Bertels is his name, essentially I have to call him at home. He's not allowed to talk to me really at work, and he told me about these. And I told someone at the National Archives in Sydney, this was 2 years ago, I said, I've heard that there are a couple of hundred files that you may have in various series, like this Z1-1 series. Z1 and C3180 is, of course, Bowen. Z3 is Pawsey. There were about 50 Pawsey files. There were about 200 Bowen files. Lots of very good information here. So I said, I brought this piece of paper, this listing. I said, I know this is not in your finding aids. It's not online, but I think you have it. And one of the more experienced archivists there said, yes, I think I've seen about 10 meters of things there that are said not yet classified, and it's been there for a couple of decades. This was it. So now they're just putting it now on their finding aids at this moment. So this is, I think this shows that perseverance in archives pays if you go along and keep on asking questions and ensure that you have the trust of the archivist, and make sure they can trust you, you can trust them, and describe to them what you need. I think I've learned a lot, and I really owe a lot to Woody who pointed the way for us. We're following in his footsteps, not very steady, and there are a number of lesions that do occur when we meant to be learning lessons. Thank you.
So, questions for our panelists? Yes.
It's not enough if we have the material, such as letters written by from so-and-so to so-and-so. But you have to have an interpreter to what the writer actually meant. And the person who received the letter
Yes.
understood from it.
Yes.
I'll give you one example. It used to be common for observatories all over the world to send copies of their publications as well as the students' theses to other observatories. Until quite a few years ago, they used to send copies of dissertations and internal reports and all that. I once sent my copy of my thesis to Jan Oort because it was the big name, and there are the Radio Astronomy Center in Holland. So I got a very nice letter from him, and congratulating this and that. And then the the last sentence said, we are planning to do a similar set of observations of this particular region, and I hope when your telescope comes, that you will be continuing your work in other regions. So I showed it to Bart, because I was so happy to get this. Bart said, do you know what Jan actually meant? No, I said, no. It said, young friend, you have done all you can. Now leave it to Papa Jan to do the rest.
Yeah, right. That's a good story. Yeah, right. I take your point.
All right, welcome, Jeff.
Miller, I can speak from bitter experience that even up until certainly including 1968, radio physics management were still reconstructing authorships of papers.
Yes,
Behind the author's back.
correct. Yep, they certainly were. And that was,
Now can I ask Woody a question?
yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Miller. It's just this question of bias. I mean, you were saying that it's essential to publish results or at least details of experiments which didn't lead to fruition.
If you're doing a history.
If you're doing a history. But we sit there and we tell our graduate students, look, don't go into long detail about a piece of this research which didn't work out. Don't go directly to the point and say what did work. So
I
there's
agree.
a serious bias there to begin with, which you're never going to get over it.
No, it's exactly right. The training as a scientist is exactly the opposite to what the historian wants to say.
Yeah.
Sometimes there will be an introductory thing that will give an interesting story as to how some things happen. Usually that's not even there. And so it's a conundrum. And it's, of course, one thing is that you don't look only at the publications, you look at the correspondence and other types of like interviews if people are still alive. But it sure is a real problem.
Bill?
Let me come a little more local from my very limited recent research into the archive here in Canada. I discovered that the federal government, the federal library called SISTI, had destroyed or removed a lot of archive material relevant to radio astronomy at least, and had the text retyped without the figures. However, that was 2 or 3 years ago. But this spring, when I looked, when I was researching my talk, it turns out that the University of Toronto Library and the Queen's Library both have a lot of original books under the category of science in Canada. And I went to the Robarts Library, as the library at U of T, and found a whole series of books on the Canada yearbooks, for example, which library was mentioned. And I've heard that Waterloo might have a very good archive. In other words, what I'm developing this is that maybe the universities who really possess, key universities of the older ones, possess the best archives for this country. That's my hypothesis, but
I haven't looked either, but I think it's something that we do need to do, especially for this project, trying to answer the question.
What's the quality of the finding aids for NRC documents?
For the finding is, well, I'm not sure what you mean by that question, but what I did find was that the Canadian, someone in Canada, whether it was the federal government or not, has its own call system separate from the Library of Congress numbers. And I put one in my abstract at the bottom just to nail it down. And it's used apparently by Toronto and Queen's and a few other universities. But many people I talked to have never seen this column before. But I asked one librarian, and she knew immediately what it was. In fact, it was Mary Ferguson. She recognized it. So
But the quality of finding aids is what I mean is how specific are, because finding aids can be erroneous, they can be too general to be any use, or they can have too much detail. But you need enough detail in a finding aid And if you want to look at good finding aids, look at Ellen's. Her finding aids are fantastic, because if I want to find anything that she has, I know I'll look at her finding aids and I will go there. It'll take me a couple of minutes. Whereas if you could look at the National Archives of Australia, and some finding aids will say Pawsey, 1930 to 1945. Well, that's kind of useless.
Well, this is what I was talking about the difference between a small archive and a larger, a much larger one. They have more people, more staff, but when you're focused on a particular topic, if you have a highly specialized archive, that's where you're going to get your better finding aids.
But retyping of reports, was this? What was their motivation to retype?
I think it was because, I'm not sure what it was. Maybe they were saving
I mean,
space.
this is terrible from a historical point of
They
view.
have been throwing out the figures, all the illustrations.
Well, that's
because
terrible too.
That saves space. So I think there's some idea.
This is
some
not good
idea-
archival practice.
Right.
But there's also the issue in an archive is whether the documents, you can search on keywords. Now, that's a very important issue I have found. And again, I keep on beating up on the National Archives of Australia, but they deserve to be beat up. They have a lot of digitized material on radio astronomy. NRO has paid for it, ironically. But it's not searchable. It's, they're saved as something like JPEG images or something like that. They're not PDF.
Okay.
So that's absurd that they've scanned them and not made PDF out of them, and you complain to them.
Yeah, no, I haven't. I didn't even pursue it. This was a couple of 3 years ago, and I just gave up and went to the universities, the old universities. And they're the best, for me, they were the best sources that I had to do with in science.
I spent 3 days in the Queen's Archives in the last month or so, and I was relatively well impressed by the way they were organized, and they were very helpful. And then I discovered that over in the Science and Engineering Library, there was an immense archive, as far as I can tell, almost totally uncatalogued in the stacks in the basement, tens of meters of material. I found out about it sort of late one afternoon, ran over, thought I would be able to go through it quickly, and I spoke to the librarian. Oh, he said, I've only been here 3 years, but I haven't been in that area yet. And he went down to the stacks with me, and he kept saying, oh, that's what that is, that's what that is. And they have, as I say, tens of meters of material. There's the Richie Covington collection, the papers of Vic Hughes are there, there's a whole bunch of stuff, and as far as I know, it is unsearchable.
So no finding aids.
Raiders of the Dark Ark.
To tell you about my experience at the archive at White Sands Missile Range down in New Mexico.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting place. It's not really sponsored by White Sands, the Army, which runs it, but it's all volunteer based. And so every Thursday, about 8 to 10 old retirees show up at this place. None of them are younger than 70. Some of them are sort of hitting 85. And they all go in there and they will be cataloging, they will be transposing data and VHS tapes to DVDs. They'll be servicing clients who ask it. And they have a pretty decent finding aid. You can at least find a mention of something, but you really have to go to the archive to see it. And so I went down and I scanned something like 800 photographs and documents and such, but it's these old timers, because you have a young person comes in and sees a picture of some radar, and they'll say radar, but show it to somebody who knows, oh, this is a Nike X radar and it was built over here, and so it's institutionally you have to have people who know something about it, and so that's the hard part. I mean,
Yeah.
To ask you guys a question, when I was looking through the archives here, which are, there's no finding chart, no aid and no finding aid. But I found, for instance, John Galt asked Jack Locke, can you tell me about your experience with the site survey? Now, you look at Jack Locke's official write-up on that in the JRASC, and he never mentions the fact that he went to Green Bank or Owens Valley by way, right, of those two. But here he does, in just a letter to Jack, to John Gall. I found a letter to Alan Barrett from Ron Allen. So these were things that are now going to be in your emails. And you mentioned that. And but these were two important things,
Yeah.
parts of the story of DRAO that just would have been lost because it would have been in someone's email inbox.
So do you know about the ERA report from
I-
1958?
I don't. What is the ERA?
That's available online
Okay.
in the NRC archive.
Okay.
It's the site survey that talks about
Oh,
everything.
yeah. I have the REED report. That's the one.
Yeah,
Yes,
it's-
I have that.
It's
but-
an ERA report.
Yes, but they don't cover those particular details that he had brought up in the letter of his reminiscence. But what I'm getting at there is simply, have you guys given any thought to what it's going to be like in 10, 15 years when those sort of letters aren't in an archive?
I'm pessimistic, as I said.
There's just,
It's a huge problem,
yeah.
and not that much money is going into it. So,
And the other issue is everybody treats their email in a different way. Some people delete everything once they've dealt with it. Some people keep everything no matter what it is. Some people are selective. So everybody becomes a records manager. Everybody has a delete key. And everybody has their own bias. And it really changes things.
I know the assistant director at Stewart Observatory, every email, once he read it, he deleted it.
Yeah.
Because then it wouldn't be in the record and he could be held responsible for anything that might happen.
Maybe we could get WikiLeaks.
Yeah.
Elizabeth.
I'd just like to mention that you ought to be careful with the NRC Online Archive because it's pretty terrible. A lot of those pictures, there's actually no description of what it is. You'd be interested to know that parts of Penticton are in Algonquin Park. It's just all mixed up.
Yeah.
Elizabeth had.
Yeah, I want to make a comment which is actually only tangential to this specific discussion, but it is related. And that is the often unrecognised effect of procedure upon people and things. By that I mean two sorts of procedure. One is, for instance, if you have an idea, a solution, a clever idea, and you only write it, you scribble on the back of a beer mat and show it to your colleagues, and you talk about it, it stays at that level of status. Once you publish it and it gets onto a printed page, this is the great discovery. It gets recognised and heralded and hailed as such. Similarly, and this is going to happen to all of us, possibly not very long hence, when we pass on or retire, the moment our materials get put into some archive, we become much more famous than we are now when we're actually working with them.
or infamous.
So in a sense that does impinge on the way archives and archivists work. We say we take the great names. Each of us is a great name in his or her own field, because we're all very individualistic in the research we do. But
Well, none of us said take only the great names for archives. You can't take everything, but
you can't
But
take
if you
everything.
only take the Nobel Prize winners, then you're getting a completely distorted view.
Exactly. Many a flower is born to blush unseen.
All right.
Wayne.
Yeah, well, I was interested in this comment you guys were speaking about, this loss of material and so on and so on. But I wanted to hear from you, what do you think about the quantity of material that's actually available today versus, say, what you can get from the 19th century or the 17th century? It must be orders of magnitude larger, just the material that's out there.
Oh, yeah. Well, of course, it's closer in time, and so
Yeah.
that makes it easier.
It'll
But
decay.
nevertheless, we are producing far more words per person
Yeah.
than 200 years ago.
And the signal noise in archival material is so low.
That's right. The signal's probably the same, and the noise is 100 times worse.
But I think all of us, you can get incredibly efficient. Like when I was at the National Archives this year for 2 days now, and of course, I'm well known there. They're ready for me when I get there.
Oh, no,
They
here he
have the
comes
files are
again.
sitting, yeah, they do say that, but they have all the files are out there. I've already ordered them online. The light table's ready, and in 2 days, I could copy 3,000 pages. And of those 3,000 pages with this camera, because that's a great technology now, and you don't spend much time, and you have to force yourself when you do this, don't read anything.
Right.
Because that's dangerous. But 3,000 pages, and of those 3,000 pages, I bet there were only a couple hundred interesting. But you can do that quickly once you know the field.
But also, I in particular have been decrying the dark ages, but of course the web is incredible resource. You used to have to travel somewhere to search, and now people have fascinating stuff posted that you can, with Google, find. It's just amazing. So I mean, that's a big plus of our time. This email thing, I don't know.
I think that mutual with email and digital information, I mean, the problem really is that information is very mutable. It's not just losable, but mutable. You mentioned the web as a resource, and the signal-to-noise ratio there is absolutely terrible, partly because it's so easy to generate information and put it out there. But you get a letter that's signed by Martin Ryle, and generally you can regard that as a mutable situation. But I mean, I've seen statements made by what Covington did and what Covington didn't do, circulating on websites, etc. It's completely wrong.
Right, but of course you have to look at the authority of the website maker. Which is often difficult to determine, but you have to try to do your best. You know, if it's a website, NREO's History of Astronomy website, that Ellen is largely responsible for, and Ken Kellerman and others, you know, it's very reliable. But as you say, anybody can put anything up. You know, amateur astronomers put up all kinds of stuff about history that's completely...
If something is said by enough people for enough time...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, it can mislead, but still, it's a marvelous resource.
Oh, no, I agree.
That's good, yes. This should be the last question, I think, so Phil, yes?
Just a brief comment, as I've been thinking about these issues of losing data, losing information, as paper goes away and as CDs get destroyed, we have an enormous advantage in storage of data through technology. And that's probably going to increase exponentially in the future. So in principle, things can be preserved. What we need is librarian and computer science expertise to catalog them and to enable future generations to find them. We don't have a problem about the storage. We won't have.
Well, I would suggest that we continue this conversation at dinner, and let's thank our panelists.